The psychology of Job does not begin in suffering, it begins in order. Because Job's mind is shaped first by stability, routine, and a life that makes sense. He is born into a world where goodness seems to produce goodness, where righteousness seems to produce peace, where responsibility seems to produce blessing. His early internal world is structured, symmetrical, predictable. He wakes with the quiet confidence of a man who believes deeply in the relationship between moral integrity and divine favor. His psychology develops inside a framework where life feels coherent. This coherence becomes his internal compass. Job's mind is not the mind of a naive man. It is the mind of a consistent man. His routines, his prayers, his sacrifices, his way of viewing life, these are not desperate attempts to control the world, but expressions of internal order. His brain is wired for responsibility. He refuses chaos because chaos offends his sense of meaning. He believes his life is not random, that actions matter, that choices carry weight. This belief shapes his emotional tone. He becomes calm, measured, steady. Stability becomes his psychological foundation. This inner stability is reinforced by the environment around him. Job is respected, honored, trusted. People come to him for advice because he is emotionally predictable, morally reliable, intellectually grounded, and his possessions, his wealth, his household, his reputation, become external reflections of his internal order. They mirror the harmony he has cultivated internally. His blessings do not create pride, they create gratitude. Job does not feel entitled, he feels responsible. This difference shapes the way he moves through life. He carries abundance with humility, not arrogance. But this order, this inner equilibrium, contains a vulnerability. He believes deeply in fairness. And fairness, when internalized too heavily, can create a silent dependence on predictability. Job's mind therefore becomes attached, not to wealth, not to status, but to understanding. His understanding becomes part of his identity. He believes he comprehends how the world works, and that his place in it is secure. This is the root of his confidence. This is also the root of his pain. When the first tremors of loss strike, Job's initial reaction is not disbelief, but confusion. His mind reaches for patterns he has always relied on, and finds that the patterns no longer hold. A mind shaped by order is shaken most deeply by contradiction. Job is not merely hurt by what he loses. He is destabilized by how he loses it. The randomness, the suddenness, the scale of the tragedy, all of it attacks the architecture of his inner world. When his children die, a fracture appears inside him. His grief is not just emotional, it is existential. His sense of meaning collapses inward. His brain cannot reconcile the incongruity. Righteousness should not coexist with devastation. His psychology enters a crisis not because he doubts God, but because he no longer understands God. Understanding, the thing he once held as a moral anchor, becomes a shattered compass. His emotions swirl in directions he cannot decode. Yet Job's first instinct is restraint. He does not allow his mind to spiral into accusation. His self-control, shaped by years of discipline, steps forward to protect him. This psychological restraint is not denial, it is dignity. Job refuses to erupt because he refuses to lose the last piece of order he can still control, himself. This inner restraint is why he initially bows his head instead of breaking apart. He clings to reverence not because he feels strong, but because it is the only structure he has left. But suffering multiplies, and restraint begins to crack. Physical pain assaults him next. His body becomes a battlefield, and the mind cannot ignore the body. Job's psychology becomes flooded with signals of distress. Pain interrupts thought. Pain erodes clarity. Pain generates a new kind of vulnerability, a sense of being trapped inside one's own skin. And as his body deteriorates, his mind begins to associate his condition with abandonment. Pain does not only hurt, it isolates. It whispers lies about being unseen, unheard, forgotten. Job's mind begins to fight an invisible enemy, the fear of meaninglessness. The arrival of his friends intensifies the psychological conflict. Their presence holds the promise of comfort, but their words deliver the sting of misunderstanding. They speak with theological certainty, but psychological blindness. They interpret Job's suffering through formulas he no longer believes in. Their insistence that suffering must be the result of hidden sin digs into his deepest wound, the wound of moral confusion. Job's mind rebels, not against God, but against reduction. He refuses to accept explanations that shrink his suffering into a simple equation. His psychology is too honest for such superficial comfort. His anger emerges not as rebellion, but as integrity. His frustration is the frustration of a man who refuses to lie to himself to make others comfortable. His anger is clean, not corrupt. It is the anger of truth, not pride. As the debates continue, Job's mind undergoes transformation. The pressure forces his thoughts into depths he has never explored. He begins to articulate truths that are raw, unpolished, deeply existential. He questions not because he doubts God's existence, but because he seeks God's consistency. His questions become expressions of a wounded relationship, not of separation. He speaks to God because he still believes God can hear. His questioning is a form of intimacy. To cry out is to assume presence. This is a crucial part of Job's psychology. He never stops directing his pain toward God. Even in confusion, he stays connected. This psychological tether keeps him from collapsing into despair. His hope becomes thin, stretched, worn, but it remains unbroken. And in that fragile hope, his mind discovers something new. Humility not as submission, but as survival. He learns that sometimes the mind must bow before mystery, not because mystery wins, but because mystery holds truths the mind cannot yet bear. Job's psychology in suffering reveals a profound awareness of self. He recognizes his emotional fractures. He acknowledges his despair without letting it devour him. He feels abandoned, yet refuses to abandon his belief in relationship. His mind becomes a battlefield of contradictions: confidence and doubt, reverence and protest, anguish and hope. Yet these contradictions do not destroy him. They expand him. His psyche stretches to hold more complexity than it ever has before. This stretching is painful, but necessary. Job's relationship with silence also becomes central to his internal world. When God initially remains silent, Job interprets the silence as distance. But inwardly, silence creates space. Job's mind, stripped of answers, becomes sensitive. His attention sharpens. His awareness deepens. Silence becomes a teacher. It forces introspection, forces vulnerability, forces humility without humiliation. Silence expands the internal room in which Job's eventual revelation will dwell. When God finally speaks, the psychological shift inside Job is seismic. The voice does not answer Job's questions, it answers Job's condition. God offers perspective instead of explanation, and perspective restructures Job's mind. The revelation does not correct Job by diminishing him, it corrects him by enlarging him. Job realizes that the universe is wider than his understanding, deeper than his logic, richer than his frameworks. His psychology expands from order to wonder. Order kept him righteous, wonder makes him wise. In this moment, Job discovers a new form of humility. Not the humility of defeat, but the humility of awe. His internal world, once shaped by structure, now becomes shaped by scale. His mind no longer needs to understand in order to trust. Trust becomes an act of vision, not of certainty. Job's faith transforms from predictable obedience to existential reverence. His psychology becomes anchored not in comprehension, but in connection. This shift restores Job's equilibrium, not the equilibrium of his former life, which depended on a moral formula, but a deeper equilibrium built on surrender. Surrender for Job is not passive, it is psychological liberation. He no longer fights for control because he no longer believes control is the path to meaning. He discovers that meaning exists even in mystery, that purpose lives even in pain. The divine presence can coexist with unanswered questions. Job's restoration, later in life, reflects a healed mind, but it does not erase the marks of his suffering. His psychology after the storm is more tender, more perceptive, more aware of the fragility of human assumptions. He understands joy differently. He holds blessing differently. He carries gratitude with a softness he did not possess before. His relational depth increases. His empathy expands. Trauma, instead of closing his heart, has expanded it. Job becomes a man who sees, not just circumstances, but souls. His mind holds wisdom shaped by paradox, that pain and goodness can coexist, that righteousness does not shield one from storms, that questioning does not destroy faith. His psychology becomes the psychology of someone who has walked through the collapse of meaning and emerged with a greater one. Job's story is not about suffering alone. It is about the evolution of a mind from simplicity to complexity, from certainty to trust, from understanding to awe. His psychology is the journey of a soul that learned to breathe underwater, think under pressure, and stand even when the ground beneath him cracked open. In the end, Job becomes not a man who understands everything, but a man who understands enough. Enough to remain humble. Enough to remain faithful. Enough to remain whole. and enough to recognize that the mind grows not by preserving order, but by surviving disorder.